Hey everybody, welcome back to Backlog Banter. I'm your boy Abram, joined as usual by my flicking his light on co-host, Tucker Hazel, and we're here today to do something interesting, actually. We're here to be confused, and we're here to wade into the very deep and very complicated and very nebulous waters of platforming in video games.
And you might be asking yourself, that's fucking simple. What are these morons doing? They're confused about what platforming is? But nay, dear viewer, I feel like I'm Tanner Dykstra. He says shit like that.
Nay, yeah, that is a Tanner word.
We have a lot of different thoughts about this, and it's more complicated than you might think. Historically, definitionally, evolutionary-wise, it's very, very fascinating.
It's very fascinating because some of my favorite games are platformers, right? Sonic Mania, for instance, is a very, very simple game.
So there's a blue
It's
guy?
a one-button platformer. You have blue guy, he starts at the left, he goes to the right, you can only interact with one button. But in reality, as we learned when we asked our community to submit ideas for this topic, when you really get into what platforming was, is, and maybe even will be in the future, it starts to become extremely strange and weird. And I don't even know what to think about this topic. So if you appreciate the bravery of doing the video with really no clear concept of what I'm going to say,
but a lot of preparation.
A lot of prep. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, ring the bell, reward us for shooting from the hip, because I think it's going to be pretty interesting. And if you want to be part of that massive amount of preparation, if you want to come into the community and be hip level in the conversation, as it were.
So we're shooting from them?
Join the Discord. We're shooting from the hip. See, Tucker, it's the theme of today is confusion. I don't even know what I'm saying, but what I do know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, I know this when I wake up, I know it when I go to bed. You should join the Discord. Link as usual. Top of the description. I said the other plugs. Tucker, we were having a conversation while I was playing Halo the other night about the fact that Sonic and Mario are releasing within 3 days of each other and bringing back the kind of marquee, full-price, AAA 2D platformer. And we were just like trying to figure out what the most recent one before those two was. And we're having a hard time. And I think that hard time is, well, at the center of this video. Because, again, platforming is not the straightforward genre that you might think it is when you just like think mechanically, okay, what is a 2D platformer? Even what is a 3D platformer? Simple mechanical interactions, but there's like a legacy there that is quite unclear.
A legacy
ultimately.
and an evolution that I think is what I'm most excited to drill in on, how platforming as kind of the default state of video games, I would say, for a while, especially in that NES, Super Nintendo, Genesis era, was the easiest thing you could think of for a video game. It's what video games were, and the way that we evolved over the years, the games evolved over the years, to make it feel like where we are today, and the fact that we're getting a 2D Mario and a 2D Sonic not only releasing in the same year, but 3 days apart from one another, which is fucking insane. And that they kind of feel weird releasing as AAA big budget games in a 2D platforming space because we don't get that many of them. How did we get to that point, and where did platforming go, if not in that the biggest devs are making 2D platformers? Because you think back to the NES and the Super Nintendo. If you're making a fucking video game, you want to break into the space, you're going to make a 2D platformer. If you're fucking EA and you want a 2D platform, you make Jelly Boy. And that shit's on NSO 30 years later. You want, what, Rystar? Fucking Pugsy? Where are we going with this? But there are so many 2D platformers in this time, it's the default. And that is very much not the case anymore. The amount of AAA 2D platforming games that we get from these big developers, over the last decade, you can count on, fingers and toes. Maybe.
Well, I mean, I think what you're illustrating here, Tucker, is that platforming really is the Cotton Eye Joe of video game genres. Where did it come from? Where did it go?
It's pretty clear
That's what we're here to discuss.
To be honest. so
that, you know what?
That box checked off.
half the mystery solved.
By the end of this video, you will know the other half of that question.
I think Metroid Dread is an interesting game to talk about for a moment. And not even about the game itself, frankly, but the response to it. Because Metroid Dread was, I mean, if we can just keep getting broader and broader, right? If you think about retail priced AAA, just 2D video games, just talking about only using 2 dimensions. There was a lot of backlash to the idea of Metroid Prime Dread.
Imagine a Prime Dread.
Finally,
good Prime.
Of Metroid Dread being $60 for a 2D game.
Where's the third axis?
But as I think you're describing, Tucker, if this was 1994 when Super Metroid releases, nobody is thinking, man, I can't believe I'm spending this much money for a 2D game. Now, obviously, unless you're playing Stunt Race FX or F-Zero or whatever, you're not attuned to 3D, right? And I think that you have to imagine that a component of the conversation about where did the 2D platformer go is that the 2D platformer moved to spheres that maybe made more sense in the eyes of the consumer. The indie space where games typically cost less. Side modes, components of larger experiences.
Like, remember Bayonetta 3? Remember the Jean missions? Those are kind of 2D platformers. I just want to flex my knowledge there.
The thing about it, though, is like...
there's
no doubt that the...
Squid Jump in Splatoon 1.
Pull it.
2D platformer.
Sure. Honestly, sure. Honestly, sure. I think part of it, and I think part that I don't really know how to unpack, is that expectation... somewhere along the way, expectation of video games became that 2D is lesser than, and also that any traditional platformer is lesser than also. And I mean, you can probably point to an era where this happened. 6th generation, obviously there's no shortage of 2D platform, just 3D platformers, largely 3D mascot platformers and licensed games and various things. And a lot of that stuff ended up on 7th Gen 2. You look at Wii, you look at especially the licensed libraries on like 360 and PS3, there's plenty of 3D platforming there too, but like there's got to be a moment, right? And I'm going to pause at a moment. I'm just curious what you think of this. Again, at the broadest level, platforming, I feel like games like Uncharted 2, Assassin's Creed 2, and various things were like an inflection point for what platforming ultimately was. So that's like 2009. And I think you could probably, again, we did a lot of prep, but we didn't prep this point because I'm just coming up with this point right now. You could probably see a drop-off around this time in the number of marquee AAA platformers you get.
Possible. Except for from Nintendo.
But it'd be interesting, except for from Nintendo, of course. But Nintendo's an outlier in this entire conversation for the most part. But I think that that's an interesting idea to wrestle with on its own. Just this idea that platforming, as a function of like audience expectation, lost relevance somewhere along the way.
The mainstream.
Do you think that this window
as a drive to why you're purchasing your next big video game? I certainly agree with that. But actually, I think we should start kind of because there are actually quite a few of our community comments that appeal to something like that. So, but we're going to start with something just to kind of what our palates a little bit. From Daniel Neveroli, who, of course, wets my palate, of the Nerd Gods fame. He says, platforming has changed a bit throughout the years, but running and jumping have remained a constant. The biggest changes have probably occurred by modern controls or more complex mechanics. Levels have gotten longer and have more going on. Both 2D and 3D platformers have lost a good amount of mainstream relevance, as we were talking about, but 2D more so. Most of the 2D platformers we get now are from indies. Platformers will always have a place in the industry, even if they are less popular today than they used to be. So, that kind of just
and this
swirls everything up that we were just saying, puts a little bow on it. Would you put a bow on
It's interesting, though, this...
I don't know. I'm mixing my metaphors.
Probably not. Maybe a candy ribbon, perhaps? Those don't taste good, though.
Is that real? Is it
I feel like they're going to break your teeth.
Are they hard?
Yeah, candy ribbons. Yeah.
All right, I'll have to do a little research.
You could build barricades out of them. I think what Daniel says at the end is actually interesting, and another thing that I'm not sure about. This idea of platformers being less popular now than they used to be. This is also another thing that I'm not sure I agree with necessarily. And another interesting component. Because, chew on this for a second, Tucker. The platformer might be less mainstream in some sense of the term. Well, there's no doubt that New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe selling 12 million copies runs circles around frankly, the majority of games, even at AAA level. But then you also have to think about the sheer number of units that games like Celeste have sold and Super Meat Boy. And again, that's me staying in the very, 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 very narrow understanding of what a 2D platformer is. You start looking at 3D platformers and things, right? As we balloon our definition and things. Crash Bandicoot Insane Trilogy is an astronomically large hit.
Crash 4 killed its studio.
So Activision killed its studio. Spyro, they just announced for whatever reason that the game sold 10 million copies. The Reignited trilogy. And you could probably make an argument that some of that's predicated on nostalgia. And you could maybe even make an argument that Super Mario Odyssey being the highest selling 3D Mario platformer is a function of brand recognition and a lot of things. You could probably say that Celeste's cheaper price point helped out, but at a certain point, platforming. You keep adding they're all platform. You can add whatever asterisk you want on there. And this is what's interesting to me. By volume, there's no doubt that there's less platformers, strict platformers. I would say
by percentage of the industry, or like what matters to the industry. That's personally true, or probably true. But I think what's most interesting to me about this topic is where there are these inflection points. We talk about that mid 360 PS3 generation where the action-adventure game, with all of its platforming elements that I would certainly want to talk about, become the norm. And everyone's frankly copying that and building upon that to this day. And that is one of the inflection points. I would say, obviously, the transition to N64 and PS1 is another one of the most major inflection points in the entire history, not only of the medium, obviously, but specifically in platforming, where Nintendo is not even making many 2D platformers in the era. They're making them on Game Boy, but when we're talking about their home console games, Yoshi's Story, Kirby 64, and 3D platformers become the thing. And suddenly 3D platformers, and I would say that this still remains true to this day, those become what the definition of platforming to the modern audience is. And we're still getting those to this day. It Takes Two just won a couple years ago. That is very much a 3D platformer. Of course, through the lens of a 2020s designed video game, but Psychonauts 2 and Mario Odyssey and Hat in Time and Yooka-Laylee, 3D platformers haven't gone away, but obviously in that N64 PS1 era, that became what platforming was understood as. And so you take these points where there's evolutions of what platforming was understood to be by the masses, and each one kind of tips a domino that ends up where we are today, where frankly, all the dominoes are kind of tipped, but we're kind of spread all over the place now in terms of what platforming is.
Let's think about Banjo-Kazooie for a second.
I love that idea.
Let me say something crazy here. Banjo-Kazooie, just hold you. Banjo-Kazooie, Banjo-Tooie, Donkey Kong 64. Especially as those games get bigger and bigger and bigger, so Donkey Kong 64 on the biggest end. There's not a huge difference in some ways between Donkey Kong 64 and like Far Cry 3.
Okay.
Let me explain. And I think this kind of gets to the heart of your notion of these inflection points and kind of what happens to the platformer. The where did he go? The second part, the Cotton Eye Joe quandary. You play a collectathon, right?
I do.
What Rare was making. Yeah, I try.
They're some of my favorite fun games. Goddamn.
I just want when Donkey Kong 64 comes, I'll be.
You're not gonna like
because
that
I just
game,
love
though.
Chunky. I love Chunky Kong.
That's a great point. My bad.
If I could play as Chunky Kong and Banjo-Kazooie, I'd like it more.
Sure, there's a mod out there somewhere.
Think about. And let's get reductive.
Perfect. We love that here on BLB.
If you're in an area of one of Rare's collectathons,
like say Free
and
ZZ Peaks,
there's a bunch of Free ZZ Peaks, you've got a bunch of widgets to collect, right?
Jiggies, if you will.
And there's jiggies, there's Jinjos, there's feathers, there's eggs, there's all kinds of shit, right? How different is it really from exploring a 3D environment where the main predicate is exploring to find things and collecting these little MacGuffins to fill up the MacGuffin meter and fighting the enemies and exploring geography.
And cleaning up the map. No, I think you're absolutely making a good point. And then, of course, you draw that out into, Spider-Man and Horizon Zero Dawn, where it's like, you look at the fucking map, and there's backpacks and crimes to solve and fucking little doodads to collect. You're right. It's not that much different. Of course, the structure, I think, becomes the part that really engages people. The fact that Mario 64 and Banjo-Kazooie and Jak and Daxter and Ratchet and Clank, these games are less predicated on the moment-to-moment jumping than their 2D counterparts were, and more the experience of the adventure and the exploration. And I think that draw, the slow change from platforming to 3D platforming to collectathons to 3D action adventure games in the open world space, that you can track that lineage to where the draw became the exploration and not the precision platforming that is what platforming started as. But, and I think that I actually want to pull in a comment here from Adam Hurd. There is still some DNA of platformers in, as you were saying, we're tracking this lineage in these games that we're kind of frankly tired of at this point. Open world action adventure, fucking check your shit off a map and fucking clear some towers. All that nonsense. Adam says, I'm just going to read from the beginning here, says, a platformer, in my mind, is a game that focuses its main gameplay loop on movement challenges. Even with Uncharted, most of the more memorable moments in the series are platforming/movement challenges. All about the climbing, jumping, and getting to places. In fact, and this is the perfect little encapsulation of what I was getting at, I'd say that platforming is half the DNA of the quote-unquote PlayStation House style that's been very popular since the end of the PS3 alongside Heavy Rain cinematic stuff. So that kind of lines up with what we've been talking about, but with Uncharted 2 and Assassin's Creed 2. Naughty Dog and Insomniac, and I would also bring in Sucker Punch, are Sony's biggest developers right now, and they have a development philosophy that started with Crash and Spyro, parentheses, and Sly Cooper, and continues through The Last of Us and Spider-Man. It's all about movement and framing that movement through a cinematic lens.
And, I mean, Ghost of Tsushima is not that different either, necessarily, as you're kind of clambering around throughout the towns and getting the jump on people and the drop on them and everything. And I think he's right. I mean, I think this is I think that Crash Bandicoot to Uncharted is the more sensible line to draw than Banjo-Kazooie to Far Cry. Probably.
But the same thought process applies.
It's But here's what's interesting, right? You want to talk about... Let's think about Insomniac for a second, right? Think about Spider-Man. Another thing you like.
I do. And I have been quite a lot recently.
And Tucker, I don't want to get your fucking goose out of its gander. But depending on how long it takes you to edit and upload this, you might be playing Spider-Man 2.
Don't fucking ask me.
Now, Adam says something there, right? That it's all about movement. What is the exact quote?
That's the last part. It's all about movement and framing that movement through a cinematic lens.
Okay. Here's the thing. So is he saying that, because this is where I think we need to start getting tricky. Spider-Man is more about movement than maybe anything
more than
else.
Any other game, maybe.
I would argue. Now, is it platforming to swing around in New York City? Maybe. In some ways, I think yes. In some other ways, I think probably no. It might be a little bit closer to traversal than platforming.
And now we're getting the stickiest wicket that ever stuck.
But let me explain this to you for a second. And this is, again, we're getting deeper and deeper into Uncharted territory here.
We can talk about it. Uncharted.
When you're playing, and I think, let's bring Uncharted into this point I'm about to make here. When you're swinging around New York, you don't have to attach your webs to anything. They just attach to something. There's really no threat in the context of that action necessarily. It's not that different. And again, we're getting this is about drumming up ideas, right? So just let me go wherever I need to go.
I'll probably knock them down if they're a little bit too weird. I liked your Banjo-Kazooie to Far Cry one. You're on thin ice though.
Let's say you're thinking about Gone Home.
God.
If you walk through the house in Gone Home, there's the same amount of threat or really consideration for your for where your feet fall as there is for your webs go in Spider-Man. You wouldn't say that Gone Home is a platformer.
This is a tenuous one. I'm gonna stop you kind of halfway through,
but what I'm trying to explain is to me, and this goes to what is platforming. I think that there has to be a danger intrinsic to the action for it to really be platforming opposed to traversal. Because, again, Spider-Man, you're swinging around wherever. It doesn't matter. There's no risk. You just land on the ground. It's
I believe they're adding fall damage, by the way, in the next one, which is fucking crazy.
Maybe it's closer to platforming then, right? But, so there's one thing, right? It's basically walking in the air. You're walking to the Gone Home house, you're swinging through New York. Are you following me so far? In Uncharted, when you're jumping around, you can fall off of that shit. Now, not very easily, because the whole point of Uncharted is to have they want you to have as little gameplay friction as possible, right? But there's a risk there in tied to the action that I think is more platforming like. Because if you think back to Super Mario Brothers, the walking is not what makes Mario a platformer. What you're doing is you're going from platform to platform. And there's a risk there.
When you are not on the platform, there is risk.
Yeah.
And actually, in Spider-Man,
there is no...
When you're in the air, that's the fucking best moment. There's the negative risk. You're fucking feeling elated. You're like, holy shit, I can't believe I'm doing this.
And so, I don't know if this resonates with you at all, but I feel like Spider-Man is making me wonder about whether that there's a marked difference between traversal and platforming, and if the relationship between the player character and the environment is really at the heart of platforming. And if there's a particular relationship.
I agree on the largest scale. And frankly, I think that you honing in on Spider-Man is both a great thing for this conversation and kind of an unnecessary detour. Because I think that Uncharted is really the parallel that we were ended up drawing here, as Naughty Dog goes from Crash Bandicoot to Uncharted and maintains the idea of clambering and jumping and leaping being the primary action that Uncharted is known for. But I think that there is a little bit of a difference, because I think that you can make some pretty safe comparisons to 2D platformers where the jump is not the risk. But you would be fucking off your rocker to not call them 2D platformers. Yoshi on Super Nintendo. What's the fucking game called? Yoshi's Island. Yoshi's Island. No risk to jumping at all. Like, you're not jumping on top of enemies. You're not jumping over many gaps, frankly. Or Kirby. I mean, there are gaps, but most of the time you're jumping, you can mitigate that risk whenever you want to by pressing that button again and continuing to go up in the air. And so I agree with you on large part, and I think that's maybe part of the reason why I wouldn't consider something like Spider-Man a platformer. But I also don't think it's a one-to-one Venn diagram, because there are platformers that are predicated on that jump and that traversal that don't have that same risk, but can't really be placed into any other category.
I think, Tucker, you're probably right. And again, I'm just spitballing here.
It's just therapy.
I'm bebopping, I'm scatting.
That's what we call the video.
That's honestly a funny title. I want to read a comment here from Theemini, who says, what makes a platformer, and this is really building out this idea here, what makes a platformer is when the act of movement is the goal. And this might be complicating what we're talking about a little bit here, maybe getting us closer to the truth. A lot of games have platformer sections, like the infamous jumping puzzle in Destiny's Raids, where we can sit and laugh at Warlock jumps, but it's also an arena shooter. But I'll call something a platformer when the entire game is that. Uncharted Vita Edition is a platformer. We're going to let that go. Mirror's Edge is like that for 2/3 of the game until they needed a final boss level. Mario is quintessentially that. Movement is the goal. And see, that I think is maybe a little bit closer to what you're saying in some ways. In some ways, it's closer to what Adam's saying and doesn't get as much further. But I think this idea, the most useful part of this for me in unpicking these locks here is this very little bit about... I'll call something a platformer when the entire game is that. What do you think about that idea? Because I feel like we've interrogated how the player should relate to the movement and the environment and everything, and maybe we don't have an answer. So maybe the answer lies in that ratio.
Maybe. Yeah, well, I think
what
my mind is frankly kind of stuck on one thing, which is the word movement I think is a little too broad to apply to this, because Mario Kart, the movement is the fucking goal of that game. Movement is so broad, and there are, frankly, so few games that are not about movement in almost their primary capacity, that I disagree with that one thing, but I don't think it means that the larger structure of there being that one word, I just don't think it's movement. But the shared goal of a rival, maybe. I don't know.
That's another thing. That's another thing. Maybe, but again, the goal of Mario Kart to arrive at the finish line. The goal of Fortnite is to wipe out Tomato Town and Chug Jug and get to the end. Yeah.
As far as we know.
Get the gritty and things like that. I think that this point about the ratio of components is probably the closest that the world could come to universally agree, right? Because ultimately, what are genre labels really than just like pointing to the largest and most prevalent
Absolutely. Part. And what we're really honing in on here, and this is obvious if you know, frankly, anything about the breadth of the game industry, there's exceptions to everything. You saying that risk in movement equates to platforming is not untrue, because that applies to 90+% of all platformers. Just me saying that Kirby and Yoshi don't apply to that doesn't mean that it's not on the whole true. And I think that me also saying that movement is too broad of a term, that doesn't mean it's not still technically accurate to what we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because if the ratio is what's important, think about a game like Captain Toad Treasure Tracker, right? In some ways, its kind of fusion of mechanics lends itself to the generalized adventure genre category, which is I would say, I don't know if you would disagree, I don't think you would, the most useless genre category.
Oh yeah. What the fuck does that mean?
But in some ways, I think the Captain Toad Treasure Tracker is definitely a 3D platformer. I think that Captain Toad, again, maybe this is going to be me still trying to push back against your pushback of my definition. But if you think
it's
about
like
Captain Toad, right?
Wizard! Captain Toad?
Is the beach flag minigame in 1-2 Switch a platformer?
What the fuck? Because you're running?
The beach rally? When you play Captain Toad, you are in this confined environment where really the considerations are how you're going to interact with your environment to solve obstacle challenges, essentially. Now, Toad can't jump, and jump is typically something
Why doesn't he just take
with a
off his
platformer.
back? How fucking important gotta be?
What is he carrying, ultimately? That's the bigger question. But, right? So we're missing the jump, but it's all about this very close relationship with the level design and figuring out how to sort of traverse it and get around and reach an objective at the end, get the star, move on to the next stage. When you put it in that way, it's not that dissimilar from Mario, and obviously Captain Toad came from Super Mario 3D World.
Galaxy.
However, And Tucker, the character, you're right. We can't forget the Toad Brigade. However, do we open it? And here's really my question for you. If we say Captain Toad is a platformer, are we opening the door to allow things to be platformers that aren't? In other words, is Captain Toad's relationship to his environment, and that being really the predicate of the game, not enough to make it a platformer? Could you make an argument, if Captain Toad is a platformer, that FromSoft games are platformers?
Yeah.
Really, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that I would say Captain Toad's not a platformer. I think that the core aspect that maybe we're really honing in on here is the idea of upward thrust, largely. Because the idea of getting over something and using that as... Well, actually, we can talk about that game. Using that as the mode of interaction is still something that all of these games that we're talking about share. There are no platformers that I can think of that don't have upward thrust as their main core of their movement.
I just did a quick Goog.
Okay, we need to pause real quick. Google. My headset stopped working. I think I actually need to stop. What do you think about upward thrust, Abram Diener?
Well, you know how much I enjoy it. But I think again we might be encountering tricky territory. Now, I did a quick Google search of platformers without a jump button.
Run them off by me.
And
sure. Okay.
I'm actually not going to use any of the ones they talk about. Because they talk about Marble Madness in this list. And now this, of course, brings me to a series that I love that you don't.
Super Monkey Ball.
Say it with me on 3. Super Monkey Ball. I don't really think that there's much debate
3D platform, absolutely.
that Super Monkey Ball is a platformer. But there's momentum.
Abram, I raised you.
The game's all about momentum.
Banana Blitz.
That is fair, but again, keep in mind the fact that every Monkey Ball game before Banana Blitz had no jump. But they are platformers.
Yes,
there's no vertical thrust there at all. And the thing about it, and again, what are we doing here? We're trying to synthesize material. Captain Toad and Super Monkey Ball are very similar.
I agree with that.
No, think it through. Super Monkey Ball is all about being glued to the ground, for the most part, and finding ways to get to the end of a stage. Coming to know the environment and manipulating it to solve an environmental challenge. The relationship in Monkey Ball is between the player and the stage. The relationship in Captain Toad is between Captain Toad and the stage. Again, there's differences because Captain Toad has a puzzle emphasis. Obviously, the Monkey Ball doesn't. But Monkey Ball has an arcade element that Captain Toad doesn't. But if you reduce what's different and just look at what's the same, and we can agree that Super Monkey Ball is a platformer, where does this leave us on Captain Toad? And thus, where does this leave us on the definition of platformer?
You're not fucking helping.
And I think that's why I'm so excited about this conversation. And I think let's read a comment here to try to get out of the quagmire.
Isn't that guy in fucking Family Guy?
I want to read.
Sure.
I want to read a comment from our good friend Brendan. Brendan says, "Well, pinpointing which games are platformers can be tricky, as we're finding out. That's true of any game genre. To be honest, it's still a useful term. The question of if, quote, platformer still works as a genre label is kind of built on a false premise. The solution isn't to redefine the term, isn't the redefinition of the term, it's the broadening..." This sentence is not right, Brendan. The solution isn't to redefine... The solution isn't... Let me fix it in my head. The solution isn't to redefine the term, it's to broaden how we label games to help explain the gameplay to prospective players. The most accurate way to label Neon White is probably first-person platformer/shooter, instead of debating whether it's more shooter and more platformer.
I just want to make Brendan, you're in the clear for half of the problem.
One for two.
So this is interesting. I think that while I really think that drilling in on certain elements of platforming and trying to find this nugget is really fascinating.
Yeah.
The answer to the solution is there's not one. Like we knew that going in. We were just going to try our fucking best to dig through the shit and try to find it. And we've brought up examples and counterpoints and playing Wizard and all of this. But what really fascinates me about platforming, and platformers by extension, is the way from which we went from it being a dominant force in the industry to the way that you posited your thesis in a failed version of this video, going from a genre to an action, which I think is very interesting because platforming, as the idea of hopping from platform to platform, doing some jumping, doing some traversal, trying to get from point A to point B, I think we can probably agree that those are all elements that are generally associated with platformers, applied to most games in some way. And there are very few games that do not include some element of that. And that, I think, is what's really fascinating, is the way that platforming as a platformers as a genre and the action of platforming has proliferated because it was so popular and because there's been so much time in games history for different people to take an attempt with what's going to work with jumping or jumping with combat or jumping with puzzles or jumping with emphasis on speed or any litany of things, that now we end up in a place where platformers, as we traditionally knew them, are the significant minority of games that involve platforming. Now, there are a lot of platforming games, and when you go on Backlog and you sort your fucking games by genre, you get a lot of games on there that are obviously nothing alike. But in some way, I think there are a couple cheats in there, but in some way, they're almost all platforming games in some way. Platforming games as opposed to platformers. What do you think about that?
I think what you're getting to, especially at the end there, it speaks to what I was preoccupied thinking about when you were talking. Because you said you liked my thesis, and I don't.
Sure.
That's part of the reason why we're on take 2 of the video.
Okay.
Let me refine it a little bit. Platforming went from a game's, on the whole, looking at industry level, platforming and these tenets of it that you were describing went from the dominant action in gameplay
I would 100%
to a supplemental action in gameplay.
I actually have
I think that's a better way to phrase it.
Platforming as a secondary action.
I think Neon White is a great example of what Brendan's from what Brendan said. However, it's not a great example. Never mind. Sorry, Brendan. Because I feel like that satisfies a different condition of the two being almost equal. Well, actually, frankly, the platforming really in Neon White might be dominant still. So let's put that to the side. Sorry, Brendan. In the context of what you were saying was a good point. In the context of what I was trying to use it for, it doesn't work.
That's my prime example.
But let's think about shooters, and let's think about Halo Infinite. Part of the reason I really like Halo Infinite is Halo Infinite's really about movement. The Halo series
always have been. It's significantly more than almost every other first-person shooter.
It always has been, and I think 343 really took it to a new level with a couple of the pieces of equipment, particularly really the grapple shot. Obviously, we had like the jetpack as like an armor ability and reach, but part of what makes Halo really fun is that Halo is about interacting with the environment and jumping around. There's really not a whole lot of peeking cover when you're playing Halo. You're not going to be able to kill somebody fast enough that way. You're going to have to move around. You're going to have to be jumping. You have to be varying the axis upon which your hitbox is on, right? That's all an important part of Halo. It's an important part of a lot of shooters of its ilk. Arena shooters, I think, is something that was brought up in the larger crawl community conversation on this topic. I think that that's a clearer example of where platforming is secondary.
Another
but still
example
essential,
I would say even
right?
more core is Doom Eternal. That game has a lot of different platforming elements. You've got your fucking air dodge and your fucking grapple hook, and you're going from floating hell circle to floating hell circle. That is just as much of a 3D platformer in terms of how you're jumping around the environment as Mario 64 was. But that game is primarily a first-person shooter. It'd be very hard to deny that. But platforming is core to that game's design.
Great point. This is also where I think... And this is a spiritual Brendan reference, because obviously it's not the one he wrote, but if you think about Metroid, right, platforming is obviously essential. I was thinking about Metroid Prime in particular, because I think, as much as you hate to do that, we already thought about Banjo-Kazooie for you, now we're thinking about Metroid Prime for me.
It's kind of like a one for you.
All the people on the right... People on the right side of history over here are going to enjoy talking about Metroid Prime for a moment. Metroid Prime is a game that for a long time, to Brendan's point about genre being used just as a way to explain a game to a prospective person, Metroid Prime has always had an issue being defined by genre. A lot of people say Metroid Prime is a first-person shooter.
Yeah, I would say it is.
In some ways, that's true. In a lot of ways, it looks extremely different than almost any other first-person shooter ever conceptualized. It's a lot closer to how, like... Portal also has a gun, but the gun is used to shoot things. You shoot in Metroid, or Slime Rancher, but the game is maybe predicated on something other than just the shooting. In Portal, it's about the sort of a philosophy of solving a puzzle and wrapping your head around it. In Metroid Prime, it's the exploration, and a lot of times it's about platforming. But Metroid Prime's not a platformer.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is, I think the case could pretty easily be made that it's a platformer. I think that there are certain sections of it where you have to turn into a ball, or the ceiling is too low to have it be a platformer. But for the most part, you're jumping around on floating platforms and hopping across gaps in the way that you would in Jak and Daxter or Crash Bandicoot. And so, while the interactivity, in terms of what you're looking at, the HUD, is first-person shooter, the mode of traversal through the world is a 3D platformer. The map design is the only thing that keeps it separated from things like Jak and Crash and Mario 64 Spyro. But I think that in the same vein, I think Metroidvanias are 2D platformers. I think that the fact that the map is designed in a different way, and the goal is to upgrade yourself in a way that it's not in traditional 2D platformers, doesn't discount the fact that platforming is the main mode of progression in basically every Metroidvania. You talk about Hollow Knight or Ori or Metroid, you're jumping around on precise platformers to get to where you're going, and that's just as much platforming as a Mario game was. And I think that is another one of those crux points. When Metroid comes out and platforming, as they understood it in the early NES days, was complicated by, you're not trying to get to the end of the stage, you're trying to get to the other area of a larger map to complete a goal that is not just finishing the stage and moving on to the next part, but allowing yourself to get access to another part of the map, but almost always by unlocking some sort of platforming ability, whether that's a wall jump or a double jump or something, or a bomb that's going to let you blow up a bomb but jump up into a little hole. Most of Metroidvanias are 2D platformers, and so I think that Metroid Prime then becomes a 3D platformer.
What here's what we've done. We've moved beyond the Abram Buhner very, very like primordial level.
Oh, I like the idea of primordial platformers. That's fun.
And we've gotten to a place where almost there's a debate here, really, that I think in what we've both said about Metroid Prime, we kind of embody different sides of, between Theemony and this idea of constantly a platformer when the entire game is at, and the notion of the ratio of components to, which is maybe where my head initially went when I thought about categorizing Metroid Prime, to where what you're saying is much closer to what Brendan is suggesting, where it's about broadening how we label games to explain the gameplay. And I think that in some ways that's really the most absolutely. Utilitarian thing we can do, is figure out how can we use platforming to help people. It's like when Grimes said we'll solve the world's problems with gaming and cryptocurrency. She was trying to help people. Platforming. Uh-oh. But then here becomes the problem for me. Herein lies the rub. And where I think that there's a paradox here for me in trying to decide where I land on the other side, right? If you broaden the definition water and water to include more games into the bucket of platforming, to where the games we're include platforming as a, to use our terminology from before, like a supplemental action, at what point do we mislead somebody who comes into a game expecting a platformer and then getting something that's too far away from what they wanted? And now this is tricky, because I might be getting into the territory Brennan says we should avoid of trying to redefine the term platforming. But I think maybe what I'm trying to do is just try to really find the edges of it a little bit better. Because one of the reasons I'm so excited about Super Mario Wonder, and I'm going to make it super subjective for a second, is that when I want to play a platformer, I want a platformer as theoretically understands the main
focus of the design of the game.
Where I'm just platforming. I don't want to upgrade anything. I don't want to explore. I don't want to really fight. I want to just platform. And so, and this actually is something that ended up coming up on the Dave Dreamcast. What was it? The Dave Brawl Banter Crawl Dreamcast, talking about Gunbrella. And the idea of Gunbrella being a platformer. Or, well, let's not put the air quotes around it yet. A platformer. But to me, my excitement for the game was taken down a little bit when I learned that, well, it also includes these other components to its gameplay that, for me, get away from the idea of a pure platformer. Now, obviously, this is where we have puzzle platformer.
There's a lot of
action platformer. We have subdivisions, but at a certain point, I wonder if to Brendan's point, this is about utility. Does it become futility to call these games platformers?
Really good, I think you make a compelling point that a lot of what makes game genres as annoying and complex as they are is that the goal is to find a word that describes the game in such a general sense that someone can hear that word and have a general idea of what that game is going to be like. Yeah. But the truth of the matter, and I think this becomes the distinction between platformers and platforming, is that games are not just one thing.
Yeah.
And when you talk about platforming or RPG elements, those are things that show up in many games and many with those combined. And it doesn't make them less of those things. They include those elements. They're not, just there off in the corner. I mean, I guess maybe they might be in some games. But I think you're right in that calling Metroid Prime a platformer might not be a correct association with genre in terms of experience.
Yeah.
But in terms of design, I pretty much think it's undeniable that the interaction with the world is near one-to-one with something like Jak and Daxter, where you're hopping between fucking floating platforms. That happens plenty in Metroid Prime. And it even actually includes some elements of something like platforming in Sonic, which is not about necessarily the precision jumping from platform to platform, though that happens sometimes in Sonic, and I personally would argue that's where those games are at their least enjoyable, is rolling around and using momentum to get from place to place. That happens in Sonic, and that also happens with the Morph Ball in Metroid Prime.
Yeah. It also happens in Super Monkey Ball, and Super Monkey Ball is close to Captain Toad. So by merit of Sonic's existence, Captain Toad's a platformer again.
Sonic's not a platformer. That's what we're coming down on.
You raise a point about interacting with the environment. And I want to read a comment here from Murph.
You know what? I was just rewatching a video of ours in which I think it was Murph's first time commenting, and I didn't want to say friend of the show yet because he hadn't been around enough. I didn't want it to go to his head. But Murph, if you're watching this, I want to let you know you're now a friend of the show. Took about 6 months. You've done it, buddy. That's a great fucking point.
We also met Murph in person, so yeah. We call people friends of the show for much less. And I should be clear, by the way, some of these comments I have truncated because people just got really excited, which I love to see, but also we can't be reading 4-paragraph responses here. It doesn't. So I've made some Brums notes.
Not as cool as
notes,
Tuckaways,
but for Brums.
Oh well.
Here's what I think. We should read Murph's comment. And Murph says, platforming is when you hold forward while pushing a jump button. Sometimes you hold backwards, but you're almost never not holding a direction. Now, I actually think that's an interesting thing to talk about.
I think that's actually very similar to the movement is the point of a platformer. Okay, fucking holding the stick is the point of... Shut the fuck up. That's not true.
You're going to lose friend of the show status. It sounds like Murph. Platformers are the most diegetic of games because it's the most interaction with the environment you can get. Clever platformers use this to their advantage by making the platforms make physical sense in the environment. Then he goes on to give several examples, including Tropical Freeze, which is a great one, but I skipped it. Sorry, Murph. In this way, a platformer is one of the most aesthetically flexible genres of games there is. It's pretty hard to screw up a platformer mechanically, though you definitely know when you're playing one that they have screwed it up as the implication there. That all means that really the worst thing a platformer can do is be boring. Now, Murph introduces this idea here that I'm going to reduce down most simply to interaction per square inch.
Sure.
That's really what he's talking about. He's talking about the most interaction with the environment. I don't know how I feel about this. Here's what you think for a second, because here's what I want to say. I think that, let's think about New Super Mario Bros. Wii for a moment.
I do, actually.
You have it behind you.
I forgot about that.
In many ways, it's the antithesis to what Murph is talking about here, this notion of designing platforms that have a contiguous sense.
And by the way, when he says best, I really think that is his favorite, and I agree with that, but, like, let's be fucking real. Like, Mario 3 is not less of a fucking platformer because there's shit floating in the sky and, like, a fucking music block and stuff.
Right. But the point I'm trying to raise is that the level design in a platformer is maybe more useful. Put it this way. Let's go back to the notion of per square inch. The utility per square inch in level design in a platformer must necessarily be much higher than in other genres. Because you think about you're playing a big open world game. Let's give the example of Grand Theft Auto 5 because it proves the point nicely here. You're in Los Santos. You can't go into most of the buildings. Most of the buildings, you can't climb them, right? They just are there. Great point. But when you look at a level in Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, every interactable piece of level design geometry is meant to be engaged with and utilized. So I think that in some way, in some sick, twisted, fucking perverted way, what Murph is saying is correct. However, Tucker, I don't know if... Because he's saying that platformers exhibit this quality the best. Refers to him as the most diegetic. First, I'm not sure diegetic is being used properly in a sentence. But we can intuit how it's being used. I think what he's probably saying is that they're the most diegetic.
I didn't think of it that way.
But here's the problem, Tucker. Because I would reckon that Minecraft's environment is obviously a lot more... it's a lot more useful. In Minecraft, literally every single one-by-one space in the entire world, whether something is occupying it or not, is a
and sometimes in many ways.
Even Breath... Or think about Breath of the Wild's Hyrule. The ways Link can intimately interact with that environment. Are we going to call Breath of the Wild a platformer? Maybe we can try. But it would go back to my point from before of then we are thus misleading people. If we say Breath of the Wild is a 3D platformer, they would say, well, maybe if I bought the DLC and I'm playing on the part where there's a little balloon islands, and I can jump between those. But I think what I'm getting at here is that Murph makes a point that I think draws us to a realization about the level design philosophy of platformers. They must foremost be useful. But I don't think use correlates necessarily to the definition of a platformer, or even the heart of a platformer. Because Minecraft is not a platformer. You can do Minecraft parkour till the fucking cows come home, till the mushrooms come home. Yeah. But that doesn't make it a platformer.
I've kind of had a sine wave of like, do I agree with this or not, as we reading through it and talking about it. Because at first I'm like, no, what the fuck are you talking about? And then I was like, oh no, you know what? That makes a lot of sense. Because I do think that there is something to be said of there being a lot more focused purpose to every piece placed into a 2D platforming level than, of course, there's a lot of purpose put into the placement of a lot of games, but most of the level geometry, even in something as focused as, say, a Resident Evil game, you're not interacting with most of that geometry. It's mostly space. But a platformer, they place each thing to be interacted with, or at least with the possibility of it being interacted with. Whereas most 3D games, frankly, there's a lot of stuff that is there as environment, as set dressing, as atmosphere, and not as intentionally interactables. But I also think that that's not... Again, much like what we've been talking about here, it's not an inherent quality. That does not a platformer make, but it's pretty important for making a platformer.
Well, let me ask you this, Tucker. Is it possible then that essentially what we're creating in this video is a list of criteria for what makes a platformer at the primordial level? Is it possible? And I don't know. This is, again...
And so we try to find like all these Venn diagrams and we see where they intersect. And then that's the fucking platformer in the middle.
Because maybe...
Yeah.
Maybe that's what platforming is. So let's just have that idea in the back of our head. Yeah, platformers. Let's read another comment, just because I think we've got two comments left, I believe. We've got Bro... And we've got Phil, quote unquote, Lepil. You pick. I'm gonna go with Bros. Whichever you want.
Murph. Might as well go to Bro next. Yeah.
Bro
says Metroidvanias are platformers, but we don't call them that anymore. Those aren't going out of fashion anytime soon. Platformers, even in the Nintendo sphere, radically change or have unique identities even within a franchise's branding. Mario games pride themselves on variety per level. Someone thought to give Yoshi his own game and how Yoshi would move differently within that game. That's it. That's a sentence. Oh. I thought there was another clause. Minor decisions like this represent how the untapped potential and influences that we are seeing even into today. Something like Pizza Tower and Anton Blast represent specific underutilized influences and becoming a thing into themselves. The creative potential is always there, everywhere. Take a deep breath.
This makes me wonder something that we won't
By the way,
answer.
That's this whole video. Nothing new for today.
No, but this is really almost non sequitur. But he says Metroidvanias are platformers. We don't call them those today. And we could probably actually go to the the Internet Archive and look at some old Nintendo Power magazines and find the answer to this. But what were people calling these games back in the 90s?
I don't know off the top of my head. Know? My gut goes with what Bro was saying and something that I brought up earlier. For when, let's just say, Metroid came out, there's no way to understand that game in a 1987 mindset that is not, this is a platformer. I am jumping from a thing here to a thing here and avoiding an enemy. That's a fucking platformer. And it's just as much a platformer in terms of its combat as something like Ninja Gaiden or Mega Man. And those are definitely platformers in terms of going from left to right and jumping from platform to platform. Yeah. The difference becomes, as I was mentioning earlier, the structure of the levels is different. But I would say that you and I would probably agree that a segmented level with a defined goal is not an inherent part of a platformer. It might be part of a traditional or primordial platformer, as we were saying, but with the introduction of Metroidvanias and 3D platforming, and then all the subgenres that burgeoned in the indie space going forward, show that it can't be the case that just having a point A to point B level design structure is an inherent part of a platformer.
I mean, in these spaces you're mentioning, you're talking about burgeoning. We've done our best to avoid burgeoning on camera, but
do it in public a lot.
I'm not a fucking exhibitionist in the panel here tonight. What do you make of this notion that the creative potential is always there everywhere? Because the examples of games he gives prior, Pizza Tower and Anton Blast, are very much
platformers is
just
the fucking end of the goddamn goal. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I mean they pull from all their disparate influences from Crash to Wario Land to Sonic, but they are very traditional platformers. And I think this idea that there always been the creative potential for new things is interesting, because at the same time that that's true, or at least Bro posits that it's true, we're seeing platforming become a secondary action, and the sort of implication there is because it no longer makes sense as the primary action. So how do you reconcile these ideas? And I think part of this might be a larger industry point, which is why it might not be easy to do, but reconcile this idea that there is so much for the platform to give still, but wide sects of the industry have no interest in giving
Well, I think that those aren't as separate as you make them out to be. And they certainly aren't in my mind, is because I would say that the potential for platforming as we understood it in those primordial days and wasn't really fucked with that much outside of your action platformers or the introduction of Metroidvanias, is that I disagree that that platformers as the traditional primordial idea that we've talked about have much more to give. There were so fucking many, and obviously that was a oversaturated genre that frankly burned out. There was so much of it, and it was so ubiquitous that people were ready to move on to fucking Metal Gear and JRPGs and shit that happened in the fucking in 3D platformers, of course, overtaking it because that felt fresh at the time. But I think the difference becomes platforming as what we understood it to be, as a element of DNA that can be experimented with, and the bubble can grow, as much as that might mean that something like Metroid Prime or Captain Toad gets lumped into that bubble. The fact that it can grow, I think, is what he's talking about in terms of there being creativity and space left to mine. Because you talk about a platformer, and okay, you combine a platformer with a shmup, and you get Mega Man, because it's a shooting platformer, and you're shooting left, right, and you're defeating your enemies, but you're also jumping from platform to platform. You combine something like Zelda, NES, that's about exploration, with Mario 1, and you get Metroid. And you combine these different ideas that don't make the platforming less of platforming, but they subsume it with other concepts to branch what any of these genres can be.
Yeah.
A shooter in the pre Mega Man days was you flying a ship through fucking space. There wasn't the physics that comes with a platformer. And so you mix those together, you get Mega Man. And I think that the idea that he's positing, and it's something that for me is the crux of, while I maybe want to drill on this in a second, more specifically, while I don't like platformers, I really like platforming as an element of game design. And I personally think that we're in a better space now that it has become decentralized from that primordial nature, as it must be get to the end of the level, and there can't be these upgrades, and there can't be RPG elements if you want to. The fact that platforming, whether it's not jumping, or it's about momentum, or including elements from any other genre, it makes that more interesting and creative than if platformer as a genre could only be applied to things that are A to B level based and don't have any RPG elements and can't have a map that also sometimes goes up, because then you get a Metroidvania and that's not platforming. That, I think, is why I agree with Bro on this. There's so much creativity because platforming is an element of DNA that can be incorporated with whatever you want, and that makes it so exciting. What are people going to do next with platforming?
It's interesting because I hear what you're saying, and again, it goes back to this idea of broadening the term. And, it goes back in some ways to sort of the innovations of those early 3D platformers, Mario, Spyro, Banjo, of saying, well, what if all of our characters' names ended with O?
Great point.
Of saying, what if the platforming was a means to opposed to
as opposed to the
opposed to the thing, a means that and I think though, I'm not trying to get all up in your grill, but I think a component of that perspective is that you don't like those core platformers, and it makes me think a little bit about racing games. I need Forza to become Forza Horizon for me to enjoy it, because I need the thing that I like to come to the thing that I don't care much about. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't keep innovating in car games in a more traditional way. Now, obviously, you can probably make an argument that the amount of space that sim racing games has to still reach before they're at their apex is probably very small. You look at the fidelity of games like GT7 and now Forza Motorsport. You're like, well, the goal of the genre has always been realism. We're basically there. But
that's what they're saying when they made fucking Gran Turismo on PS1.
I think the point I'm trying to raise is that I don't care. And so I actually kind of subconsciously just did what I'm trying to argue against, which is say, well, to me, we did it. We got GT7. We got Forza Motorsport. We're done. But that's clearly not going to be the case. Turn 10, Polyphony are going to keep innovating. And they're going to keep pushing the genre forward, and they're going to keep asserting why that's important. And the way I read Bro's comment here in the examples he gives in Pizza Tower and Anton Blast is I get a different reading out of what he's saying than what you get out of it. Because those games are nothing other than platformers. And I think what they speak to is the fact that there is still a need for the traditional platformer. And there's still a lot of great creative potential in it. I mean, Pizza Tower is one. Mario Wonder is a great example. I mean, Sonic Superstar. I think you could probably look at Sonic Superstars, even though I'm very excited about it, and say that's just more Sonic. Now, obviously, there's a lot of things that are very exciting about that game, but for the reductive point I'm trying to make, you look at Pizza Tower. There's really not that many platformers that play Pizza Tower. Even if it's a synthesis of things, what comes out the other side is very distinct. Same with Anton. Same with Mario Wonder. Those are just three of a couple examples. I think it got Brumcliffed, but Bro was also mentioning 3D platformers like Tori 3D, which are part of this genre that we haven't even touched on yet, called the expressive platformer, where, funnily enough, the movement is the thing, and it's all about stylishly getting through the stages, right? There is a lot more that the regular platformer can give. And all I would I'd just say that maybe it's worth hesitating on the idea that just platforming has nothing else in its tank. Or what I'm saying is you were saying from your perspective the exciting thing in the platformer is what more it kind of adds to its snowball. Because there's not a whole lot more to give with just the platforming, the same way that I might say the same thing about Forza. But I think the reality of both situations is that if it speaks to you, you'll see these things that are different. And if you're on the outside's perspective, Forza Horizon does the same thing that Hollow Knight does, which is bring more people into a space they might not otherwise want to be in. What does that have to do with Hollow Knight? So I'm not trying to make the Hollow Knight, because a lot of people who don't give a fuck about 2D platformers are probably going to want to play Hollow Knight for the amazing bosses and the combat and the exploring the world, right?
Yeah.
Even though it is thus still a platformer in a lot of ways. So I'm not trying to make an argument necessarily that, like, platformers are becoming less pure or something weird like that. Ultimately, I think that at the heart of what Bro is saying that I agree with, it's that when we take platforming back to just these essential components we keep coming back to, you can still remix those in ways that are very fresh. And that's super exciting. I mean, again, that's why I'm super excited for Mario Wonder. That's just platforming. But that's showing you things we've never seen before.
Especially within that high production fidelity and the creativity that Nintendo's teams bring to it. And I'm very excited. Even as someone who, in this video, blatantly stated, and have many times before, that I'm not particularly a fan of straight-up 2D platformers. Those primordial platformers we were talking about.
Yeah.
That game excites me because it feels like it might be the cusp of inspiring others to mess around with the genre in a way that hasn't really been the focus of most developers especially big developers, as we started with, for the last 10, 15 years. And I think that also colors the thought process that I have about the potential of the platformer, is when we look at the biggest 2D platformers of the last few years, outside of the indie space where it does reach more into what I was saying of incorporating elements from other genres, the primordial 2D platformer genre in the modern day is relatively slim pickings. You gotta go to something like Mario Maker, which is kind of a middle ground of doing something new and also being straight up 2D platforming.
Yeah.
Or the Retro's Donkey Kong Country games, or Ubisoft's Rayman games. Those are the exception to the rule, and even though they're amazing games, and I've actually played all of those and liked them quite a bit, they're certainly not the expanding the wheelhouse of what that can be. Tropical Freeze is not that different from the SNES DKC games, even though I think it's a lot better, but it's a great game. It's not conceptually and design-wise like that far apart. And so that does color my perspective, is that the genre has been on a lull since the 360 era, as we're kind of saying, maybe seeing this downward slope in how many people were willing to put that kind of budget and manpower into what can we do with a 2D platformer. But to circle back to my point of why I think the platformer is in the most exciting place now that ever has been, is that not only are we on the precipice of Nintendo and Sega putting their full budget marquee titles back onto the market in a way that, for Nintendo, it hasn't been that way for a decade, and for Sega, hit or miss, hasn't been that way since the fucking Genesis. Who knows? Sure, with the advanced,
probably GBA or DS. DS has really. But is
that we have the space with Nintendo and Sega bringing that back, and Anton Blast and Pizza Tower being examples of primordial platformers that are doing something new, but that we also have the space for more ideas than ever to mess around with that idea, which is what I like so much about platforming, is the idea of whether that is movement, whether that is upward thrust, whether that is the attention to the level design, these elements of platforming that I might not love when they're in their most primordial forms, but as strands of DNA, they can be fucking put into a lab and make grow a third arm. Like, oh, what the fuck is this? And that is how you get something like Loco Roco, which is definitely a 2D platformer. But instead of jumping your character, you jump the level. What the fuck is that? And to me, even just that slight twist that changes the way that I'm thinking about managing momentum and the character completely makes me reevaluate the potential of that genre. And many of my favorite games that are platformers are the ones that subvert what was coming before. And actually, we have another comment from this is the actual final comment from Adam Hurd, who mentioned stuff about indies being having the building blocks of Mario and Sonic to build on. He says, "No, Adam."
Wait, you mean Phil?
We also
have Phil.
Adam says, indies are where the traditional platformer shines more clearly. Indies are building emotionally charged platformers out of the building blocks that Mario and Sonic gave us. Starting with Braid and Limbo, this became a trend in the indie sphere. Braid was also pivotal in the shift towards puzzle platformers becoming more mainstream too. It's games like Celeste that stop Mario still for 5 seconds to ask if he's okay and if he's been thinking about suicide lately. The future of platformers takes what Mario and Sonic do well and then stabs you in the heart to make you feel something. And that's like a really, really good encapsulation of how I feel about platforming as an element for games and platformers as a genre, especially in the mutated, is this a platformer, what else do you include way that we have platforming today. is that we can get something like Super Meat Boy. That is one of the more traditional primordial 2D platformers now, but it's way more about speed and precision than probably anything that came before it. Or you get something like Celeste that is about that precision platforming, it is about levels, but is also about telling a genuine heartwarming story with great characters and thematic resonance in a way that Mario and Sonic and other Super Nintendo era primordial 2D platformers never even thought to try. And I think that idea of fractaling platforming is what gives me so much hope for the genre in the future, on a very subjective level, is that, okay, sure, the definition is muddied now. And we just spent an hour trying to pinpoint, is this an element of platforming, is it not? But I personally see that as a good thing. Because, frankly, you were right in that in my myopic view of my own taste, am not that focused on, I want primordial 2D platformers to be super going all over the place. But is that I just think there's, frankly, so much more potential to allow it to be fractaled and have the waters be muddied and have that lead to much more innovative ideas than can come out of, quote unquote, limiting yourself to that primordial 2D game space.
Yeah, let's read what Phil has to say.
You want to do it?
I'm just looking at what Phil has to say here. The lineage of pure platforming traces from Mario to Sonic and Donkey Kong to Banjo-Kazooie and Crash Bandicoot to more modern attempts like A Hat in Time and Ukulele. There's been a particular subgenre that has been prominent, the precision platformer, with stuff like Super Meat Boy and Celeste, as we've been talking about. And the common thread there is the game is testing reflexes and memory within a forward action, whether in a 2D or 3D space. And Phil actually, as he's saying there, testing reflexes and memory, I think is why I would just say, as we're getting out of this also, as he's talking about this lineage of the traditional platformer and the way that the traditional platformer has changed.
Yeah, absolutely.
That still has its place, ultimately. And I just think that there are ways to look at what platforming offers by itself that I think are really important. And it really does go back to what Murph is saying, and I feel like of all the comments that we've read today, Murph's has really resonated with me, which is this idea of just really simple and interlocked play. Everything is all about this one idea of platforming. And as Phil introduces, there's and you've mentioned it before, but I really like how he encapsulates it with this idea of...
It's rare. Don't let it happen.
I really like this idea of him encapsulating this idea that the precision platform in particular is testing a particular set of things. The same way that the expressive platformer is allowing you to have a sort of catharsis in movement, and where sometimes games have that catharsis in violence sometimes. I think that I love platformers, simple traditional platformers.
Yeah.
I don't mean simple as a derogatory way, but just as factually, usually mechanically simple platformers, for the same reason that I love on-rail shooters and I love arcade-style puzzle games like Tetris and everything. There's something that can be very uniquely derived from not having, as compelling as it is, the Metroidvania pillar of things you can test with or anything. It's just you and the character in an environment in a simple goal. I think what's going to be so fun for me about Mario Wonder is that the 2D platforming framework in that case is the fastest way from point A to point B. Point A being me, point B being joy.
And I'm between you and joy because I'm a little bit faster than you when you play the game.
Right. That's true. That's a reference to us playing the game at PAX.
And I'm stopping you from reaching joy because you're fucking annoying me.
And what I'm about to say, I need to be clear about. This is not me saying that Super Mario Odyssey is a complicated game. But Super Mario Odyssey puts more steps between me and that. What Super Mario Wonder is going to give me is just level after level of fun and ideas. And I think what the Ubisoft Rayman games also do really well. I think those music levels that are super beautiful. Or Pizza Tower might not be about connecting me directly to joy, but it's about locking me into this high-speed pell-mell slapdash, go sense of Indiana Jones being chased by the boulder that maybe you don't have when you're playing in an environment that is about taking things a little bit slower and exploring or solving a puzzle or whatever. So I think that there's a lot that you can do in Evoke on a very core level, on a primordial level. In a regular, I don't even want to say regular because I think that casts the other ones as irregular, but a more simple, mechanically simple platformer. I think sometimes you can really precisely reach an emotion or something by keeping the tools you had to work with very simple. So I like Phil sort of. Yeah. I like the two comments we ended on because you followed Adams down this path really, I think, eloquently. This idea of the fractaling is compelling for all these reasons, and I like that I could follow Phil's idea of the more quote unquote, as he says, traditional platformer.
The woke platformers are the sort of the conservative platformers.
Sort of the ability to explain why I really love these particularly simple platformers. Maybe in a way that you don't. In the same way that I don't like your platformers as much on the whole, so.
Nope.
I thought I could just keep talking over you and you would...
I'm like Anton Blast. I keep running.
No, but...
Or Sonic?
Dynamite Anton
Pizza
is a character. Peppino definitely runs faster than Anton. Unless you're doing the clutch boost in Anton Blast. And you can probably get pretty fast. But I still don't think Peppino goes so fast that his body turns into like a concept.
That man is the most stressed runner that's ever happened in a video game. He's like, oh, fuck, oh, God.
I don't think I've ever known fear the way that Peppino has known fear.